Today. Good morning. As Sergeant Carter used to say in Bowman High, I can't hear you. How's everybody doing today? Hey, there you go. Glad that you're all here this morning. And this is a part of our the racial injustice team and also our church. This is one of the forums that we're having this morning. Andrew Packman is going to lead us today in the forum. What I'd like to do before we get started is racial injustice team members. Are there any racial injustice team member here inside? No, sir. Would you please stand up? I like doing this. So we're going to start here. All right. Thank you. And they are a great team. I'm so fortunate to be on this team. I'd just like to have them introduce themselves so you'll know who's on the racial injustice team, and especially if you have any questions later on. So we'll start right here, Bob. You go ahead.
Amanda Peterson.
Turn around so you can see us.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Loriola. Teresa Schultz.
And my name is Ron Madden. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over and let him do his thing.
All right.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks to all of the members of the Racial Justice Task Force for the invitation. I love teaching at churches. This is a line of work that I was in before I started teaching in seminaries, and so this has a very special place in my heart, and so I love to get to do this, so thank you. Also thanks to your pastors for this invitation. And I bring greetings to you, speaking of seminaries, on behalf of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, where I am privileged to get to teach theology and ethics. United is a very special place, and in fact the kind of thing you'll see over the next 4 weeks is kind of indicative of the kind of theology that we do at United. It's always striving to be deeply engaged with very pressing social and political issues. So if you find yourself liking this and wanting to do more theological study, regardless of your age, we have students that range from their 20s all the way up to their 70s. Do come and see me. I would love to help you discern a call to seminary. We actually have a seminarian at United in the back here. So you have lots of people there. All right. So we are well represented today, and we're grateful. I am grateful to be here sharing with you. So besides teaching at United, race and racism is a subject of my scholarly research. And so what we'll be building to over these next few weeks is some of my own research I've done for my book that I'll be currentently trying to publish. So you will be getting early insights into the book before it hits Amazon and sells like hotcakes, I hope. But I say that as a way of saying this is a subject matter that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and studying. I feel really privileged to have gotten to study it this much. But all of that study, all of that thinking, all of that research doesn't make me any less good, or any better, that is, at being an anti-racist. It's something that all of us, no matter how much study we've done, are constantly kind of struggling with. So I lift that up just to say that I'm in the same boat as all of you as we try to figure this out. Right, so the name of the class is Coming to Terms with Race, a Primer on America's Original Sin. So why this class and why now? The most immediate reason is one I think we all share, that is a felt need to begin addressing this thing that has become especially prominent in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. So there is something in the air, there is a felt need to kind of deal with this and confront it in a way that we haven't in this country. But it's also, as much as we feel this urge to talk about it, it's difficult to talk about it. The vocabularies we have for talking about race are complicated, they're frequently changing, and conversations amongst your families and with your neighbors often, I think, gets bogged down in these semantic differences. And so there could be some value in just getting clear on what these basic terms mean when we talk about race. It's also complicated because this is really the third rail American politics. It's not something that any of us come to neutrally. There's lots of kind of energy and emotion involved in conversations about this material, and so getting clear on the terms can also help, hopefully, with some of that. And I think all of this energy that we feel in this country at this time on this topic is really pointing to a deeper concern, one that the language we currently have to talk about race in the US doesn't quite get to, and that's where I think religion and theology comes in. So one of the larger arguments I'll be making is that Christian theology actually helps in thinking about race, despite the intense complicity that Christians have had in perpetuating it. Right, so before we begin, I think since this is a Christian church, we are doing this active study as a kind of discipline of discipleship. It's good to say a word of prayer. So would you please bow your heads and pray? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. So, goals of this class. First and foremost is to provide a common vocabulary for talking about race. That's the focus of today's presentation. And I hope that this helps make it possible to come to terms with race on a deeper level, because race isn't just an idea with a vocabulary, it's a social institution with history. So to come to terms with race means taking a look at some of the bleakest moments in American history and asking, how can a nation be both founded on the supposedly self-evident truth of human equality and at the same time quite literally built by enslaved people? But race is not just an idea with a vocabulary or an institution with a history, it's also a sin with a power all of its own. So to come to terms with race as Christians means thinking theologically about race and the way it continues to structure our world and our lives. And as I said, I think that my larger claim in this class will be that if we don't think religiously and theologically about race, we will have missed something really crucial about it. So the class schedule, we'll be meeting over the next 4 weeks. Today we're talking about race as idea, institution, and sin. And then the next 2 classes will do historical dives into American life. First, the period that I call overt racism, from slavery through the civil rights movement, and then the 3rd week we'll turn to covert racism by looking at the case of housing in Chicago. This is a kind of test case of how what had been the law of the land suddenly isn't the law of the land anymore, and yet continues to structure city life, urban life, and some of our personal histories. I've spoken with several folks here who have ties to Chicago, and will recount some of these events in their living memory. And then the last week will bring you to my own kind of voice as a theologian as we think about this, race and racism as sin. So that one's called Evil Lies Close at Hand, Implicit Bias, and Soul Death. So you're welcome and invited to come to all 4 of these. If you miss one, it's fine, we're recording it, but you'll also be able to keep the thread even if you're not here each week. Right. So to begin, race as idea, institution, and sin. Race seems to be everywhere in the US, whether it's immigration, or policing, or affirmative action, or income inequality, or what to do with Confederate monuments, or the expanding scope of American prisons. Race figures into every one of our hot-button political issues. Race is one of the first things we notice when we encounter another person. It's written all over our faces. This makes race different than your religious affiliation or your national identity. In most cases, your racial identity is broadcast for the world to see. Social psychologists have discovered that when we categorize people according to race in the first 100 milliseconds of perception. That means that our brains have registered someone's race even before we've detected their gender. That's so fast that even if you went through your life trying your best not to see color, you will have already seen it. Your mind will have registered it at the level of neurological activity. Though we might like to think that our children don't see race, scientific evidence suggests otherwise. Infants as young as 6 months old have been shown to non-verbally categorize people by race. Toddlers as young as 2 use racial categories to predict people's behavior. And 3 to 5-year-olds have been shown to not only categorize people by race, but to express racial biases, linking those categories with certain patterns of behavior, that somebody's dangerous or safe, for example. And most scholars think that these biases are not ones that their parents are explicitly teaching their children. Rather, kids are just picking this up from the ether, from the culture. Race is also woven into nearly every aspect of American life. Economically, racial identity bears a strong correlation with how much money we have in the bank and how much income we earn in a year. This is maybe hard to see for those of you in the back, but according to a 2016 study by the Brookings Institute, the average white family in the US has a net worth that is approximately 10 times higher than that of the average black family. So white families here are in the green at the top, and they have a net average of $171,000, where the average black family is closer to $17,000. Now it's important to note that this chart is from 2016, so 8 years ago, but this is not from the 1880s or the 1940s. This is in the era after which the civil rights movement has been part of American life for 60 years, and yet these disparities persist. In terms of employment, race factors into who gets hired in the first place, and for those who do get hired, who gets promoted. From 2010 to 2019, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that black unemployment numbers were roughly twice that of white unemployment. And in a really telling study from 2004, researchers responded to help wanted ads in Chicago and Boston newspapers, and they did so by submitting fictitious resumes that were identical except for the names listed at the top of the resume. Half of these applications had white-sounding names like Greg and Emily, and half of the applications had black-sounding names like Lakeisha and Jamal. Despite being absolutely identical, same college, same training, same everything, the white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than the black-sounding names. As of February 2020, only 4 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies were black, and only 10 were of Latin descent, meaning that more than 97% of the wealthiest companies are led by white people. Race strongly determines where we live. This map of Chicago is a bit dated, and we'll turn to this in a few weeks more closely. This is from 2000. But it shows what anyone who's ever taken a bus across one end of town to the other will already know intuitively. White people are represented by the pink color, and Hispanic people are represented by the orange, and black people are represented by the blue. And so these lines are still quite sharp, even though it's become more intermixed and diverse over the last 60 years. These congregations of people and kind of isolations of racial groups persist. It's also been shown that where you live plays a role in how long you'll live. So if you live in Chicago's upper crusty Streeterville neighborhood, where the majority of residents are white, right downtown off of Michigan Avenue, you can expect to live until you're 90. But if you live 9 miles to the south, down in Inglewood, where the majority of residents are black, you can expect to live until you're 60. So a 30-year difference in 9 miles. Race is everywhere we look, but what is it? We have this intuitive feel for what race is and what it means. We know that white churches tend to feel different than black churches. We know that white neighborhoods tend to look different than black neighborhoods. But when we start to probe a little bit and ask questions, things get a lot murkier. How many races are there, for example? Classically, there are 4: white, black, red, and Asian. That's how the early race theories would divide the human population. But of course, Asians from India and Pakistan don't look much like Asians from Japan or China. And none of those Asians look like the people from Kazakhstan. They're all Asians, though. And white people from Sweden don't look exactly like white people from Spain and Portugal. Some racial categorization schemes have up to 27 different races. And how do you determine which race you are? This gets more complicated because who it is that fits within a certain race changes over time. Originally, white people in the US meant only Northern and Western Europeans, primarily British and French and Germans. And then when the Irish arrived en masse in the 1840s, they were generally not considered white. But they became white over time as other immigrants moved in who were less white than them. Namely the Jews, the Italians, the Hungarians, and the Slavic groups who arrived in the 1860s, who were also not considered white, but now all of these groups are considered white. Besides this, the categories we use to talk about races changes too. The term we use for indigenous persons, for example, has moved from the explicitly racist terms of the 19th century to Indians or First Nations or indigenous persons or Native Americans. And not only do these categories change, but what people mean when they say the word racism changes over time. The racism of the Nazis is different in important ways from the racism of the Ku Klux Klan, which is different from the racism of your uncle, who at Thanksgiving dinner has a bit too much to drink and starts sharing his views. And that's different from the real estate agent who discourages you from buying a home in a certain place because the schools aren't so good there. Since there are so many ways of thinking and talking about race and racism, I think a good place to start is just to get on the same page and clarify what we even mean by these terms. What is this idea of race? The truth is that the racial categories that we notice all around us and that we use to talk about ourselves and our world would seem utterly strange to anybody who lived before the late Middle Ages. That means that as strange as it might sound, there were no black people, no brown people, and no white people before about the 15th century. Now, of course, there were people with lighter and darker shades of skin, but skin color hasn't always been the primary way that human beings categorize ourselves into groups. We know this from the Bible. The ancient Israelites distinguished between different groups of people. They were a people set apart for a holy purpose, and they were different for that reason from the Hittites and the Moabites and the Egyptians and others. But you'll recall from Genesis that Joseph became a major official in the Egyptian government, despite having not been born as an Egyptian. And Moses passed as an Egyptian after having been adopted by an Egyptian princess. So these lines were not so fixed back then as they are now. In ancient Greece, the primary distinction was between citizens of a polis or a city-state and the barbarians who were outside the city walls. If you lived in Athens, and you were lucky to be a property man, one of the 1,000 citizens of that city, you had special duties and obligations to other Athenians, but you had no responsibilities to those who existed outside the wall, the barbarians. And even so, there was nothing that made you indelibly or intrinsically Athenian or Spartan or anything else. This remained true in the Roman Empire as well, where people of all different ethnic and cultural groups could become citizens of Rome. We know that Saul of Tarsus, who would later become Paul the Apostle, was a Middle Eastern Jew who happened to also be a Roman citizen. So in the ancient world, they recognized different people groups, and they have language to talk about that, usually the nations or the peoples. But the basis for these different labels were ethnic and cultural, not racial. So what's the difference? Ethnicities are groups of people who share common ancestry. They're usually from a similar part of the globe. They have similar cultural practices and language and values and rituals that they share. So examples of these might be Norwegians and Swedes and Poles and Irish and Mexicans. And if you lived in a major city in the 19th century, or even to this day, You would find ethnic enclaves in various neighborhoods where folks spoke the same language and ate the same food and practiced the same religious holidays. And membership in these groups was relatively fluid. If you marry a Norwegian, as I you can learn to make lefse, and you can learn how to like Norwegian sweaters and wear them to the Christmas concerts. And you might even start to tear up a little bit when you hear Beautiful Savior, as I do. Now, but I wasn't born a Norwegian, and I have very little Norwegian ancestry, not at all, as a matter of fact. Now, while Norwegians might prefer their culture to that of the Swedes, and I suspect they do, there's no overarching hierarchy of ethnicities. So there's no consensus that the French are somehow superior to the English, or that the Czechs are better than the Poles. Now, racial groups are different on all of these categories. A race is a subgroup of the human population that is supposedly different from all other subgroups because of a certain biological essence. At least that was the original notion. And this biological essence, something in your blood or your genes, shows up in phenotypes. So skin color and facial features and hair texture and other bodily attributes. And it's also believed, according to racial thinking, that these phenotypes, these ways that we appear, can be indicative of the kind of mental life and moral capacities that we have. This means that you can supposedly decipher somebody's smartness or unintelligence, or their laziness or hardworkingness, based on how they look. So unlike ethnicity, race is thought to be based in your biology, specifically in the blood in its original form. It's something that you're born with and you can't change. And race tends to include lots of ethnicities. Swedes and Norwegians and Poles are all white in the present day. And racial groups are almost always arranged in a hierarchy, that whites, and these change across different cultures in the world. It's different in the US than it is in South Africa, than it is in Brazil. There are a lot more racial groups in Brazil than there are in the US. But what's common in each of these locations is that white people or lighter-skinned people are always on the top, and black people or darker-skinned people are always at the bottom. There's a hierarchy of value built in. And even though there was plenty of slavery in the ancient world, it wasn't based on race. Rather, some groups would enslave other groups that they conquered. And this kind of slavery was typically not passed on from generation to generation, as it was with chattel slavery in the US and elsewhere. And it was certainly not tied to an entire race of people. So, if race was absent from the ancient world, it must have been a more recent idea, but where then did it come from? And why did we start thinking in racial terms as opposed to merely ethnic and cultural terms? Any questions? I should just stop for a moment. I've said a lot of words. Is this all clear so far? So the central takeaway from today's class that I want to impart to you is the idea that race is that the idea of race, which now looms so large in American life and factors into nearly every decision we make, was simply invented out of whole cloth. And this happened in two historical moments, and I want to take us into those next. The first act takes us to medieval Spain and the Spanish Inquisition. Spain was a religiously diverse place in the late Middle Ages. It had Catholics and Jews and Muslims. In the mid-700s, the Muslim Umayyad Caliphates had conquered all of northern Africa and finally crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain and conquered all of Spain up to the city now in France called Tours. But by the 1400s, so over the next 700 years, Christian kingdoms had regained all of France and most of Spain, except for the very southern province of Andalusia. So Spanish Christians were still pretty anxious about these remaining Jews and Muslims living in Spain, and the church and the state teamed up to force these remaining non-Christians to do one of three things. You could convert to Christianity, You can leave, or you can be killed. This was the Spanish Inquisition. Many Jews did convert. Many others fled to places like the Middle East and Eastern Europe. This is the Sephardim or Sephardic Jews. Many others were, of course, killed. But the Jews who did convert posed a problem. On the one hand, they agreed to be baptized and renounce their Judaism and to accept Jesus as the Christ. But some powerful Christians were still suspicious that these conversos, these converted Jews, were not really Christian. So, they began to exclude Jews who had converted to Christianity from holding public office. Not because they still had Jewish religious beliefs, but because they had Jewish blood. These positions in government and church life required that one have to have pure blood, which meant that they didn't have any Jewish ancestors lurking in their family trees. There had, of course, been a long history of anti-Judaism that preceded this moment, that goes all the way back to the earliest forms of Christianity, as a matter of fact. But this is the first time that we see bona fide anti-Semitism, that is, discrimination against Jews based not on their religious beliefs, but on the basis of their blood. And this, of course, reaches a ghastly climax in the 20th century, in places like Auschwitz and Dachau and Theresienstadt, when the Nazis attempted to cleanse the land of impure Jewish blood and restore a pure Aryan race. So that is Act 1 of the invention of race. Act 2 is a more complicated story that takes us into the 1600s, but before we get there, a few important cultural and political shifts had to take place. The first was the rise of natural science. So these things, without these movements, we wouldn't have the contemporary notion of race that we do have. Natural science, of course, emerged in folks like Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon and all of these others, Galileo in Italy, in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, when Europeans began using the scientific method to observe and experiment with and make sense of the world. This led to developments in anatomy and medicine, but also to the creation of the field of anthropology. And early anthropologists employed these same techniques of classification that they got from Linnaeus, that Linnaeus used to classify all of the plants into genus and species, and all of the animals into genus and species, and the whole classificatory scheme. These were then used to also classify humans into different races, subgroups, varieties of the human. So that's one movement. The second one is the rise of European colonialism. So the age of exploration that got started in the 15th century meant that Europeans were traveling far and wide across the world, encountering all kinds of new cultures and people. Now, the point of these travels weren't simply to explore. They were about claiming territory for the sovereigns who paid for those journeys and discovering new natural resources to fit into this mercantilist and eventually capitalist economy. They were there to plant their country's flag and to subdue the population and to siphon wealth back home to cities like London and Paris and Amsterdam. The third movement, and this is crucial, is the rise of Enlightenment ethics. So Enlightenment ethics is based on the idea that human beings are created equal. That is, they have an intrinsic dignity simply by having been born as humans. And this was a new invention. For the Middle Ages in the West and all before that, there was thought to be a great chain of being, where the kings and queens and royalty were at the top, and the dukes and others were below them, and then there were the peasants below them. And the kings and queens could kind of do what they wanted with the peasants. And below the peasants were animals of various different types, and below them were plants, and below them were rocks, and all of this. And above the kings and the queens were angels and demons, and eventually God at the very top. So in the Enlightenment, all of this sense that there was a kind of natural order to the human race, that there were people born into positions of leadership and higher value, occupying higher levels on this chain, came under critique. And the idea instead was said, no, every human being, by virtue of being human, has intrinsic dignity. So there are things your king and queen can't do to you because you are created with intrinsic dignity. So because we are equal, we also, they argue, have fundamental rights to be free, to chart our course and to go about our lives unhindered by any tyrant or ruling class. And so that is exemplified by Mr. Kant, Immanuel Kant here, 18th century German philosopher. So these three forces all combine to form a conflict, as you might have already intuited. How can we say that all people are created equal and have a fundamental right to freedom, and at the same time take their land from them in the name of king and country, enslave them, as Europeans did to people in the western and southern coast of Africa, and siphon off all of their natural resources to send them back to places like Paris and Madrid and Brussels? So this conflict was resolved by the invention of the idea of race. The answer to this was claim that non-white people are not fully human, which means that they are not truly equal and thus not entitled to the same freedom to which white people are entitled. The original idea of race, then, was invented out of whole cloth. It filled this gaping hole between the belief in human equality and freedom and the practices of slavery and colonization. So Europeans could insist that all human beings are equal and entitled to being free because only white people were truly human. Black people and Native Americans and others were considered to be varieties of subhuman. Because of their race, they were thought to be naturally less intelligent, less hardworking, and less capable of ruling themselves than white people. White people, in other words, are the superior race on this kind of thinking. This means that it's not just their right, but their duty to govern and civilize these not quite human populations with darker skin. It's for the good of society and the good of those non-white races. So the thinking goes. So that's where this idea came from. And it originally had 4 components to it, which I will survey here. And the truth is that today we all know now that all 4 of those are objectively false. The first idea is that humans can be neatly divided into these racial subgroups, but this has been shown to be false. The genetic differences we have are relatively minor and insignificant. Any differences that we do have can be explained with practices of selective reproduction. They're cultural patterns based on our choices, not on anything biological. So there's nothing in our genes that make white people essentially white or black people essentially black. Second, race, the original idea of race thought that race was rooted in our biology, but as we've just seen, race didn't exist in the ancient world. It was invented in the modern one for a purpose, and namely it was invented to resolve this contradiction between the belief in human equality and the realities of domination and slavery. Third, the idea held that racial groups have naturally different intellectual powers and moral capacities. This too is false. While it's certainly true that there are smarter and less smart human beings and that there are more virtuous and less virtuous human beings, these don't track with racial lines. These are just part of what it means to be human. And fourth is the idea that white people are a naturally superior race, and this is of course false too. Human beings are human beings. There's no evidence that one group or another is harder working or more moral or anything else. It also means that there's no evidence that black people as a group are naturally better at basketball, or that they're lazier, or that they're prone to criminal behavior. All of these generalizations have been shown to be false. So if the idea of race is demonstrably false, why is it still around? If race were just a bad idea, then it could have been corrected through education. Our ancestors used to think that the earth was flat, but they did some research and realized that they were wrong, that the earth is in fact round, and now most people, though not all of us, think that the earth is not flat, and problem solved. But with race, it hasn't proven so simple. This bad idea has shown incredible staying power, even after most of us have stopped believing in its truth. So how is that possible? How did race, an idea invented out of whole cloth with no basis in reality, become so real to us? So real that it correlates with how much money we have in our banks, the kind of education we receive, the values of our home, our access to medical care, our life expectancy, the chances that we'll be incarcerated, and the chances of being shot down by the police. To understand this, we need to know that race is more than an idea. It is more than the normal prejudice that one feels towards people that are different from them. It's also an institution with a history. Now, I won't spend as much time on that. I want to save some time for questions, and we're going to deal with the institutionalization of race over the next 2 weeks. But it's important to at least mention some of this to get it on the table. So, the idea here is that race can become an enduring, stable, recurring pattern of behavior. This is a definition from Sam Huntington. Stable patterns of behavior don't just happen overnight. They emerge over time and become ingrained through practice and repetition until they become like second nature. These patterns get passed on from one generation to the next, sometimes on purpose. When we teach our kids to go to the communion table and to be baptized and study the scriptures and all of those kind of institutions. But they don't always need to be done intentionally, at least not once they get up and running. So the institution of race began in a particular time for a particular purpose, which we've already seen was to justify colonization and enslavement. And these practices would last for hundreds of years and have an immense impact on the world. At its height, the British Empire controlled about a quarter of the world's population and landmass, and so everywhere the British Empire went, the idea of white racial superiority went with it. Between 1550 and 1850, some 10 million people were shipped from the west coast of Africa across the Atlantic to the New World. Everywhere these people with black skin were enslaved, the idea of white racial superiority and black inferiority went with it. These institutions didn't just spread the idea of white supremacy. The people in charge of these institutions effectively shaped the world and the social order to reflect the idea of white supremacy. So while there's no biological basis for white superiority over anybody else, white Europeans used these mechanisms to create a world where white people were consistently on top and black people were consistently at the bottom of the pecking order. This was as true in pre-Civil War USA as it was in Dutch South Africa, as it was in British Kenya, as it was in Portuguese Brazil. All around the world, white people ruled over populations of darker-skinned people. All around the world, white people were privy to educational opportunities from which darker-skinned people were excluded. All around the world, white people were privy to business opportunities from which darker-skinned people were excluded. These mechanisms institutionalized race. They repeatedly enacted these recurring patterns of behavior such that they became like a second nature. Race went from being an idea that no one had ever heard of in the ancient world to a fundamental building block of our social and political lives. So when you hear folks speak of institutional or systemic or structural racism, this is the idea that in addition to the individual prejudices that we have lurking in the recesses of our own hearts, there are these much broader, more deeply ingrained patterns that we didn't create, but that still govern our lives and shape our world. And as we'll see in the era following the Civil Rights Movement, when racial prejudice against black people would actually drop significantly, we can see this in social psychology studies where people stopped holding these racist attitudes in the same number. These recurring patterns of behavior remain firmly intact. So, the history of race is not just an idea, but an institution with a global story, as I've kind of already intuited. There's a history that follows all of these Western colonialist projects across the world, but for this class we're going to focus really on the American situation because that's where we are. And it's also worth noting that we will kind of focus primarily on white and black relations, not because those are the only racial relations, of course there are others, and to be in Minnesota is to be on land that was not originally any of ours. And so the relationship between white settlers and the native peoples who were here, whose land was expropriated from them, is just as significant, and we could do a whole class on that too. But my research and focus is on white-black relations, and so that will be the focus of this class. So, I've argued so far that we need to think about race and racism in terms of its idea and its history, but also the way that it's become institutionalized. Most conversations in the US today, I think, know what these terms, or think they know what these terms mean, but we're going to spend the next few weeks kind of digging behind them to see if that is in fact the case. But it's become common parlance today, I think, to know that race and racism is a systemic and institutional reality. That shouldn't be unusual or surprising to anybody here. And folks usually also think that the response to racism needs to be equally systemic and structural, although what we mean by structural change is not always clear, I think. The larger argument of this series, though, is that racism is not just either of these things. And in fact, to continue to think about race simply in terms of the ideas that go with it and the institutions that have come from it is still to miss something important about what's going on here. To name that little extra bit that gets left out by race as idea and institution, to name that particularly insidious, tenacious, and self-defeating character of racism in American life, I think we do well to think with some of the more ancient terms that we've inherited from the biblical tradition, namely sin. So to come to terms with racism as a sin, I think, sheds new light on the most persistent feature of American life, and maybe even opens new horizons for responding to it. Of course, sin comes with some baggage. We can talk about that too, but I think that it does illumine certain aspects of what's going on in this country around race that we don't get if we simply think in terms of these sociological categories of structures and systems. So that's what I wanted to share with you all today, but I would love to just hear any kind of responses or questions or concerns with what's been shared today as we kind of digest what we've just heard. Yes, can I hand you my mic?
Yeah, sure.
So folks can hear you? Yeah.
All right, so thank you very much. You had clarified at the end that you were going to orient this class around America since that's where we live. And a lot of the information you presented about the ideas of race were pretty centered around European experiences, which makes sense for where we are right now. I'm just curious, more from an academic perspective, do we have information about how people in sub-Saharan Africa, pre-Middle Ages and pre-European colonialism viewed race and ethnicity?
Yeah, thank you. The question was about whether there's different perspectives on ethnicity and race from non-European groups. I don't know a ton about this, but my suspicion is that there are, of course, similar kind of ethnic distinctions, but we don't find racial thinking elsewhere than in Europe. So it was a moment in world history where this way of thinking about how we look and its relation to our biology and its meaning for our intellectual and moral capacities that really is unique in terms of how people have thought about groups of people around the world. And so the rationale for kind of pointing to Europe on this is that that's where this idea came from. And given the kind of history of colonialism, it's European ideas that have then gone to shape the world, for better or worse. And so this isn't to denigrate other perspectives from other parts of the world, it's just to say that these have come to color the current reality more thoroughly. Thank you. Yeah.
This is just my thought.
Yeah.
But DNA, if we were all to take a DNA test, you might be surprised on what you really are. I sit here, blonde, blue-eyed. My family, at least me, has 1.8% Asian. Now, German, Norwegian, Irish, Scotch. I mean, we aren't what we think we are. We aren't all 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Judy. That's right. And there's been this kind of recent rise in genetic testing to kind of see what your ancestry looks like. And this does reveal some surprises sometimes, right? That people have these kind of hidden ancestors that they don't know about. But even the idea that who we really are is somehow in our genes, which all of these companies that are selling these genetic tests are trying to convince us of, does have, to my mind at least, some roots in a kind of racial thinking. That who you really are is somehow embedded in your DNA. Now, for sure, our DNA controls a ton of things, all of our biological processes. It determines, our genome determines kind of how we look. But that's who we truly are in our essence. That's a new idea. And that's, people are selling a lot of tests on this idea. Yes, Ron?
That is really true, but what you said, how you responded there. When I was younger, and my mom had a picture of this white guy on the wall, handlebar mustache, dude looked like Doc Holliday. I heard. And I used to look at that picture, but I would never say anything. And then one day I came home from school, and I asked my mom, I said, who is this guy? I said, you got him up there, and picture next to Jesus. Who is this guy? And my mom said, been waiting for you to ask that question. She said, that is my grandfather. And I said, I beg your pardon? That's my grandfather. That's your grandmother's father. And I go, really? And she said, well, our family, my granddad married my grandmother. My grandmother, make a long story short, she was part Native American, she was black, and she was Scottish. And if you ever saw, which I did, finally met my grandmother's brothers, didn't look like me at all. I didn't look like them, they didn't look like me. They had blonde hair, they had blue eyes, and I went, who are these people? So make a long story short, this year will be the first time, and my grandmother's maiden name was Macmillan. This will be the first time that the Williams family and the Macmillans are having a family reunion in Birmingham, Alabama. And this will be the first time we met that side of the family. And excuse me, we always say, that's the white side of the family. The black side of the family. But we're all mixed together. And so we're going to have a family reunion. First time we'll get a chance to meet that side of the family. I'm so excited about it. And make it real short, my daughter, Erin, May, some of you know, I remember getting a call from school, and they said, we're having a problem with Erin. I'm going, are you kidding me? This kid's a straight A student. What's wrong? You know, I go up to the school, and what the problem was that she was filling out a form, and they wanted her to identify if she was black, Native American, whatever. So she went through all the boxes. She checked them and said, no, you can't do that, Erin. You just only one box. She said, no. She said, I'm Scottish. I had asked the story. She said, I'm Scottish, I'm part Native American, I'm black, and I'm checking all these boxes. And I turned to the teachers and I said, don't call me anymore.
Thank you, Ron. Anyone else with questions or comments? Yes.
My whole thought on this is, as a Christian, how can we look at anybody else as less than? I mean, if we're all descended from Adam and Eve, and God created all of us, how, as a Christian, can somebody sit there and say, anyone is less than them? Unless their behavior is abhorrent, those people, maybe they're less than. And those are the ones calling out others as less than, so.
Thank you for that. This is the question that even the people that were doing the colonizing and the enslavements ostensibly believed in these were Christian people, right? These weren't non-Christians by and large, right? And they also were products of the Enlightenment that thought that reason itself tells us, even if we don't believe in the Bible and all of that reason commands us to treat every human being as a creature of intrinsic dignity, not to treat them as a means to our end, but as an end in itself. And yet, for all of these years, this contradiction has persisted. And so the question then is, how do you make sense of that contradiction? Right?
Just to play off that too, like also how they use the Bible to do that. So
Yeah.
how do you take something that's based on, love, understanding, acceptance, and then turn it, like we've seen done in more examples of just race, but they use it and they turn it using the same words and then derive a completely different meaning that can then harm a certain set of people. And that to me is like confounding, that we get to a place where we can use the Bible in that respect.
Well, and as we'll see in the fourth class of this series, the literature on implicit biases, I will go into some of that, some of the social science of these biases that are within us. Even though we're trying not to be racist, we still find ourselves doing racist things. This complicates it even further because good intentions and even a real hearty desire not to do things that create more racial disparities, we still do them. Like, they're built into a level of our being that isn't permeated by our conscious choices. And so what does this mean as we try to do this better? Adam, I saw you.
So you mentioned the three institutions or movements of the 16th century, the natural sciences, the colonialism, and the Enlightenment. And to my mind, I thought, oh, wasn't something else going on in the 16th century? Oh yeah, Protestantism. So the entire Protestant revolution was happening and developing alongside all of this stuff. So the question that's arising for me is, did Protestant theology develop in any ways to support what was going on here?
Yeah. Good question. Good question. This is the kind of brilliant student you find at United Theological Seminary. To answer the question, yes, there is, and there's actually there's a big literature right now showing the kind of difference in the way that Catholics would respond to some of these questions in the so-called New World versus Protestants, and the Protestants don't look so good on it. So there are some deep complicities, and of course the Enlightenment itself was this was happening in broadly Protestant countries like the UK, like Germany, northern Germany, where there were predominant Protestants. So yes, there's a religious story to be told here, and Lutherans and Protestants don't turn out to be the heroes in it. So it's a good point.
They have a belief in the higher being.
They have a belief in the higher being, and sometimes we're pretty comfortable with hierarchical social arrangements too. A couple, I see right here.
When you mentioned about the Christians, I don't remember which period it was, but when they gave the Jewish people those three choices, I wonder if that related to what Adam questioned or what they were basing that on, other than some of the words of Jesus about or the only way to heaven is through Christ and so on. But I wondered what their rationale was and what they were overlooking in the gospel.
Yeah, thank you, Marge. This stands in sharp contrast to actually some of the Muslim kingdoms that were quite tolerant, by contrast to Spain, of the so-called people of the book. So Jews and Christians were allowed to persist in their Judaism and Christian practices under Muslim rule, and in ways that the Spanish Inquisition wanted to completely purify it in Christian terms. And I think it's very perceptive theologically that there's
The choice of moving or death or becoming a Christian,
yeah.
which probably wouldn't be genuine, and you said they kind of were suspecting that.
Right. Yeah, that's right. But this is a part of the Christian heritage that we as contemporary Christians should wrestle with.
Yeah, going back to the Jewish blood part. So what was it that people who were not Jewish thought was wrong with the Jewish people and didn't want to let them have power. And could that have been based on ethnicity? The ethnic behavior of the Jewish community. There's a stereotype when you look at anti-Semitism is that, oh, the Jews are money lenders, they're financial wizards, and they're trying to steal all our money, so we're not going to let them have any power. My point is, there's a connection between racial ideas and ethnic ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. There's definitely a connection. And the stereotypes about a racial group often come from these kinds of observable patterns of behavior. Of course, Jews in the Middle Ages didn't just choose to be moneylenders. This was what they were allowed to do under Christian rule, was to deal with. So they were put in a position where they ended up doing the lending of money because usury was forbidden for Christians. And so,
against it.
exactly. And so these, but again, that's a sociological pattern, a cultural phenomenon that happens by virtue of contingent history. Like it just so happened that Christian rulers required Jews to only work in these fields. The racializing move comes whenever that cultural phenomenon gets pinned to their blood, where there's something about their biology and their essence that makes them different from the rest of us. But this problem you're hinting at about like that really perplexed a lot of Christians. Luther himself could not understand why the Jews didn't find Christ to be as compelling as he did. And so their recalcitrance to the gospel struck Luther as a problem, one that he couldn't find a way to surmount. And so this led Luther himself to say some really nasty things about Jewish people, which many of us here know. And this gets to Adam's question about kind of the Protestant roots of these concerns. I mean, there's this Protestant impulse to spread the gospel to all nations and to kind of spread it such that every knee shall bow to Christ. And so this imperial impulse is already there in very early forms of Christianity that have this kind of evangelistic sensibility. Yes?
Maybe one more.
Oh, yeah. One more question, says the pastor.
Okay, going back to the very simplistic, we're made in the image of God. They goofed and they made us people. People are greedy. You can see that throughout the course of history. Those people in power want power. And how do you get power? You control others. I'm thinking of, they came over on the Mayflower. Well, hi, we'll have Thanksgiving. Get off the land, we want it. Then, oh, here, come on into Kentucky. You get out of here. Okay, you Cherokee. Trail of Cheers down to Florida. The gold rush in South Dakota. All the people in power were after more and more. It didn't matter who they subjugated, it's just they wanted more. It was the Indians, it was the Chinese out west. If you're in power, you're going after more. It doesn't really matter, but this was one way of saying, okay, the Chinese, you're subhuman, the Indians, you're subhuman. I'm sorry, but us Mongols are not subhuman. Oh, come on. How many Mongolians are there here?
There's this point that there's a kind of greedy human impulse at the heart of race. And the invention of race, I think, is right. I think where things get complicated is after hundreds of years of it becoming so deeply embedded in our practices that even those of us who don't want to perpetuate racism, who actually are disgusted by these instances from our history and these present-day moments where we're seeing racial disparities persist and racial violence happen, that even we find ourselves keeping that going. So even though we don't have this desire to continue to get more and more and more wealth from dividing the population, the trouble we're in now, the implicit bias literature suggests, is that even those of us who want to do good find ourselves doing evil. So what do we make of that? And with that, I see there's a couple more questions. I'm happy to stick around, but I want to thank all of you for your time.